These insurrection hearings have featured vital and dramatic testimony about coups and crimes. And yet for some, a standout moment came yesterday when Republican Rusty Bowers recounted his resistance to Trump's illegal demands as a matter of faith.
It is a tenet of my faith that the Constitution is divinely inspired, of my most basic foundational beliefs.
Now, that's not a common refrain for investigative hearings or for a lot of the Americans who have been outraged by the Trump administration's crime spree and its lack of ethics. In fact, American cities and democratic areas are increasingly secular places, which is something that Republican leaders used to just rail against. To take one example who's well known, the Nixon aide turned religious warrior, Pat Buchanan, who back in the day quite literally warned of secular Americans oppressing religious Americans.
The agenda that Clinton and Clinton would impose on America: abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat units. That's change, all right. It's not the kind of change we can abide in a nation we still call God's country. There is a religious war going on.
A religious war. And that argument was central to the Republican Party's alliance with religious conservatives. After Clinton, the party leaned into a religious pitch for George W. Bush and spent years appointing the very judges who now are really, in a way, doing the opposite of Buchanan's warning. It is a Bush appointee, Justice Alito, who led and wrote the draft opinion that overrules Roe v. Wade and supports strict abortion bans. That's the draft we've seen, a ruling expected any week now after it was leaked in unusual circumstances. And that ruling going after women's rights is viewed as a capstone on a multi-decade religious quest to really, if we're being honest, make Scripture and certain selected religious tenets the foundation of American law. So judges appointed in a past era come in and try to change the rules so big government regulates women's lives and rights, as if this were a long bygone era. Now, against that context, something else is also happening. Americans across the spectrum are actually more supportive of women's rights and choice. 79% supporting gender equality, most opposing overturning Roe, opposing the vision of these judges installed by politicians in bed with the religious right. And we have people moving away from politicized religion, taking cues even on the right from more secular leaders on the new right, like Tucker Carlson, who's really the most popular conservative on TV and does not push specifically Christian themes, focusing more on race, immigration, and class. Or a right-wing warrior cited most frequently as potentially next up in the GOP. You know who I'm talking about, DeSantis. Now, he attacks big government and COVID rules, but, quote, rarely discusses religion publicly. Several of those points and quotes and the attention here on this secular emphasis are drawn from a New York Times essay by a conservative writer tracing this shift that may be happening in plain sight, how today's Republican Party has begun its divorce from the religious right. And to document that, this Times piece suggests that ongoing conservative support for Trump reflects kind of a new normal, not some aberration. That 20 years ago might have been unthinkable that someone with Donald Trump's personal history, aggressively vulgar secular style, and obvious ignorance of Christianity could ever get the Republican nomination. Forget everything else. He just couldn't get past the religious right's power over the more conservative voting base. Well, Trump got the nomination twice. And some of his top rivals, as mentioned, are not much more publicly religious than he is, which is really saying something.
When I talk about the Bible, it's very personal, so I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into...
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite?
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
You're an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy?
Probably equal. I think it's just an incredible... The whole Bible is an incredible... You got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said. You know, when we go in church and And when I drink my little wine and have my little cracker, I guess that's a form of asking for forgiveness, and I do that as often as possible.
Sure. But church-going Republicans were not fooled by a lot of that. In the 2016 primary, over 60% of Republicans who go to church weekly chose any other candidate but Trump, who was, of course, the most famous candidate and went on to win. So that's striking. He only got 32% of church-going Republicans. His nomination victory then was powered by these ascendant secular conservatives. He won 62% of Republicans who never go to church. They powered him. And there are signs that group remains potent on the right. In this Times essay, conservative writer Nate Hochman identifies this new group as, quote, non-college educated, middle and lower class white people with a populist hostility to the elites. It's a project that uses, quote, distinctly Marxian terms of a class struggle. And he dubs them middle American radicals, right-wing radicals. And he's writing from a conservative perspective. Now, this may keep some of the fervor of the religious right and that style of politics, but we don't see religion as the main North Star for the policy or ethics of these groups, and they don't really claim so. Indeed, it may speak to a kind of mixed conservative activism that really is more about protecting a certain way of life.
Giving parents a private right of action to be able to enforce the prohibition on CRT.
They are an activist school board.
We're not going to reorganize society and pretend that biology doesn't exist.
The Democrats are the party of pedophiles. The Democrats are the party of teachers, elementary school teachers trying to transition their elementary school age children and convince them they're a different gender.
So, some of all that might be obviously dismissed as lies, conspiracy theories. Some can be rebuked as code words for the same old ignorance, fear, and bigotry. If you watch this program, you may know we do a lot of reporting on civil rights and equality to deal with exactly those kind of code words. But if you broaden out to the shifting patterns of these tens of millions of people on religion and other issues, some of it may also reflect shifting beliefs and political alliances, which may shape our politics. And if people try to understand and reason with each other in a democracy, it is certainly worth trying to understand each other accurately as a lot of stuff changes. Take a tough, complex clash that we've always tried to treat with precision here on this news program, the COVID wars. Here's just two facts. One, people attacking science and vaccines made things much worse. Two, safety rules have trade-offs. And many of those trade-offs hit working and poor people harder, not elites. The data shows pandemic job pain fell unevenly on the poor and minorities while big companies flourished. And some of the leaders of this so-called new right have seized on COVID policy as much as any topic, skewering allegedly heavy-handed and elite-friendly COVID rules to attack Democrats. It was one of the factors that voters cited in backing first-time Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin in Virginia last year. You remember that off-year race? It may speak to what some conservatives call an overreach in a kind of liberal, technocratic approach to policy or safety or how to back or even mandate certain progressive goals. So, the debate is certainly fair game. And for those who find themselves uncomfortable at even thinking about challenging even one potential orthodoxy, well, that's usually a time to try even harder to keep an open mind. I guess alternatively, you could just watch Tucker Carlson in a fetal ball, but who wants to do that? We're not doing a version of that. And if this new conservatism involves conservatives and Republicans living a bit more like liberals, less church, less religious dogma guiding their choices and priorities, then why does the left and right seem more polarized than ever? And why, big question, is the Supreme Court still on the precipice of making Scripture the law of the land to regulate and oppress women? All right, that's a lot. And as I mentioned, it draws on that piece. And to explore the answer, we have the author of that New York Times essay about the decline of the religious right, Nate Hochman, who's here. His first time on the beat, a fellow at the Conservative National Review, joined by Obama campaign veteran and political history expert, Komanduri. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Good to be here, Ari.
Absolutely. So we'll talk it all out, which we like to do on The Beat. Nate, the piece was very interesting. People are reacting to it a lot, which I think is a credit to at least the way you wrote it or some of what you excavated. I posed some questions there, so the floor is yours to introduce yourself and answer.
Right. So thanks for having me on. First of all, the premise of the piece was basically that it's no secret to anyone who's been paying attention to religion and American culture in the past couple of decades that America is secularizing. Rapidly, we are seeing fewer and fewer people go to church in really precipitous declines over the course of the last couple of decades. But one thing that really hasn't been paid as much attention to over the last decade or so is the fact that this is not just happening on the left, it's happening on the right as well. The decline in American religion began in sort of liberal Protestant mainstream denominations, but it has actually expanded to a lot of conservative evangelical denominations too. So the Republican Party today is more secular and less religious than it has been in a generation or two at the very least. And that's going to have a substantive effect on the politics of the GOP and of conservatism. So I was trying to wrestle really with what does a secular, quote unquote, post-Christian conservatism look like? It's going to be more amenable to issues like gay marriage, for example, but it's also going to focus on other culture war issues that are broadly appealing to a much more secular voter base. And I think that's kind of the realignment that you're seeing today.
Jay?
Well, I'm not so sure that it's going to be more amenable to gay marriage. I mean, if you look at Ron DeSantis, what the Texas GOP recently did, basically taking a very strong line against homosexuality, I don't necessarily think that that is true. I do agree with Nate that religion has definitely declined in America. I don't think there's any question about that. And I do think that one of the reasons for Trump was that decline. As people stopped identifying as Christians, they started identifying more by race and gender. Specifically for Trump voters, their white identity and their male identity came much more to the forefront. I think that there's a sort of a false belief among a lot of intellectuals that as people become less religious, they're going to turn towards secular humanism. History has shown us that that is not true. However, I do think that this new sort of Trumpist right has all of the negatives of the old religious right. It is full of hypocrisy, selective outrage, and it really has this materialist sort of obsession with power that is really at odds with spirituality. So I think the same way that the old religious right was bad for politics and bad for religion, I think that's going to be very much true for the new Trumpist non-religious right.
Nate?
Well, 55% of Republican voters today support gay marriage. So I'm not so sure. You know, Ron DeSantis actually hasn't said anything about opposing gay marriage. So I'm not totally sure.
Well, he did the Disney thing.
Right, but that's not an opposition to gay marriage. It has to do with debates over the role of, sexual and gender instruction for young children in schools. But in terms of, the sort of accusations that this is all bigotry, the Republican Party today, the Electoral Coalition, is the most racially diverse that it has been in modern history, at least since the early 1900s. If you look at Mayra Flores' upset victory in South Texas just last week, she won a 80 to 90% Hispanic district that Joe Biden carried by 4 points just in 2020. So it's pretty clear to me that a lot of the politics that we're talking about today is actually more appealing to a lot of racial minorities who traditionally voted for Democrats. And I think that's something that Democrats and progressives have to recognize.
I'll jump in. I'll let Jay respond to that. You are grading on a curve. I mean, if you say, compared to just this post-Jim Crow era when Republicans fortified a white ruling class and it's better than that, sure, but quite a curve. You also make hold on. I'm going to finish. Hold on.
Sure.
But you also make a point that there are people being elected in a diverse coalition, so that is a real thing. What I want to also steer you to and then have Jay respond to is the other controversial point you make in the piece is you position a lot of what's happening, or some of what's happening, as a response to overreach. I alluded to that in the COVID example. Reasonable people can debate these things. Just to be clear, what portion of what you're diagnosing do you think really is a response to what you call wokeism or the left? Because during the Trump era, they weren't in power federally. So it's sort of like, what is the response to? And then Shay can respond to you.
Right. So I was responding to the specific claim that the decline of the religious right has supplanted sort of gender and racial grievance in place of religious observance. I think that's clearly not true if you look at the rapid racial diversification of the GOP coalition. But I think a lot of it has to do with sort of progressive overreach in our cultural institutions. The fact that progressives and Democrats weren't necessarily in power, at least for the first half of the Trump administration in Congress, doesn't change the fact that they have an enormous amount of power in a lot of our cultural institutions. And a lot of sort of more culturally conservative, not necessarily white, working and middle class voters are really uncomfortable with aspects of the post-Obama cultural progressive agenda. And that is what is driving them towards the GOP. Again, if you look at Mayra Flores, her victory in this 80 to 90% Hispanic South Texas district, she ran specifically on the border and immigration.
Okay,
she was telling those voters that Democrats have abandoned them on immigration. As promised,
let me bring Che in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, yes, Trump did do a little bit better. George W. Bush did a lot more, much better in 2004, if people remember. And so you're starting from a very low bar. And I think there's a lot of other things and other factors that kind of play into that. I do think that the appeal to male identity potentially could reach across racial lines. But I also don't think that that's a development that Republicans or Americans should celebrate. And as far as, you know, your discussions about wokeism, look, one thing I'll say is religion is many things. Okay, it's a way of life, it's a philosophy, it's all those things. But one of those things that it is a stone to throw at people you do not like. And when people wonder why so many evangelicals supported Donald Trump said very clearly, I will throw those stones. I will throw those stones at Muslims. I'll throw the stones at Mexicans. I'll throw those stones at the media. I will throw the stones at the deep state. And I think one thing that Christians, I would urge them to think about is this something you want to be associated with? Is this the type of spirituality, this stone-throwing spirituality that you want to be associated with? I think that's a very deep question for a lot of people of faith going forward.
Well, it is deep, and it especially speaks to the enthusiasm, not just the divorce and the peace with Trump, but the enthusiasm for Trump on the right, which we've seen in those hearings about who's really going to put up with that. This brings us to one piece of sound we have when we look at some of the people you're talking about. I don't know whether these would fit into your lexicon or not, but this is real people on the right, and some of what they're saying about policy does overlap with fear of others and bigotry. Take a listen.
I don't like the things that are happening with the illegal immigrants. They're taking our jobs.
These people that are coming in are getting free handouts and everything else like that.
You think that people are living off of the state but not doing it legally?
Absolutely, and I think it's bull.
It's not my job to subsidize someone that's here illegally.
They're trying to wash out our votes.
Change our demographics.
I think it's important for us to put America and Americans first.
You both get 30 seconds, and Nate, I want to be very precise. I'm not referring to your essay, but some of what we just heard there gets closer to what Tucker does, which gets closer to replacement theory. Minorities, racial minorities, Jews, they're here in a conspiracy to destroy white Americans, Christian or not, blah, blah, blah. Not saying you say that, but where is the role in this movement that you're diagnosing to stand up and confront that if you say that is not a good part of democracy?
Well, look, I think I would caution against sort of taking the sort of anecdotes that you hear from folks when you go out and interview random people on the street and taking that and extrapolating it to describe a broader electoral trend, right? It is, as I said, clear that the GOP is on its way to being the most racially diverse coalition that has been in a century. So if you reduce all of those developments to racism and bigotry, what you're essentially saying is that all of these non-white voters who are moving into the GOP coalition actually don't know or aren't actually conscious or aware of why they're voting for
I'll let you finish. You must be using poetic license, because when you said the words "you must be saying," you can't mean literally me, because I'm doing this segment to explore your ideas, but I'm also holding you accountable for the rise of replacement theory, which overlaps with immigration policy. I will let you finish,
right,
as Kanye would say, but I hope you don't mean me.
No, it is. I'm not specifically talking about you, but this is obviously an argument that you hear from a lot of mainstream outlets or general arguments in general, which is that what is driving any aspect of GOP politics really can be reduced to bigotry and racism and sexism, et cetera. I would caution your progressive viewers to give into that framework. I think especially if Democrats actually want to be electorally viable with demographics like Latinos, for example, who are rapidly moving right, they have to take seriously the possibility that people are pro-life, for example, because they actually have a different conception of when life begins. They don't just hate women, right? They're not just bigots.
It circles back
to engage with those
earnestly held beliefs. I have to do the referee thing and get Che his 30 seconds. We're running over on time. Che?
Yeah, look, as when it comes to religion, there are a lot of people on the left who might cheer the demise of religion. I'm not one of them. You know, I'm somebody like Elvis Costello who would like some more peace, love, and understanding in our society and our politics.
Respect.
However, keep in mind the religious right and the Trumpist religious right, or non-religious right, as you put it, is none of those things. It will bring none of those things to our politics. It will be bad for our politics, and it will be bad for religion.
Appreciate both of you having this conversation. We do need that. As Elvis Costello would say, we're watching the detectives, and you are both detectives for your respective political movements. I tried. We'll be right back.